All right, this week we're doing one of my favorite stories. It says, "Can't you make them behave, King George?" So we are on page 359 in your book, and we are going to read a narrative nonfiction. Tells about people, places, and events that are real. And as you read, look for events in the time order, factual information that tells a story. So, like, this is before reality TV, but man, King George would have been phenomenal on reality TV. Phenomenal. Like, keeping up with King George, it would have been fantastic stuff. Um, all right, so follow along with me in the book, please. And I'll go like this. I don't even know if I'm sharing my screen. Share my screen. Um, no, that was mathematics. All right, here we go. Can you make them behave, King George? So the real thing that was going on here is King George ended up picking a battle with someone, some little kid that he should have beat, which were these colonies, right? The American colonies, and he was like the father figure, like, you can't talk back to me. You want to be your own little country? I don't think so. Come here, soldiers. Go take care of these people. And then before you know it, his own people were like, can you stop? Just let him go. Let him be. Now, he either has to just say he was wrong or he has to continue. And that's what we're going to see here. Can't you make them behave, King George? Before the American Revolution, most people who had come from England to settle in North America were English subjects, loyal to the king, King George III. However, some of these colonists, and remember the colonists were the people that were living in America, they did not like that the king still made them pay money called taxes to the English government because that king was so far on the other side of the ocean. Why were they still paying him? They did not like that they had no say in the decisions made by these English government or the English government. This was the beginning of a disagreement that led to the American Revolution, which said America saying, hey, we're going to be our own country now. Thanks, King. When George came to the throne, the government was costing a lot of money. England had been fighting a long and expensive war, and when it was over, the question was, how in the world were they going to pay that for that war? Finally, a government officially suggested that one way to raise the money was, hey, we have those colonists over there in America, let's raise their taxes. What a great idea, King George said. After all, the French and Indian part of the war had been fought on the American soil for the benefit of the Americans, so why shouldn't they help pay for it? The fact that America had also spent money and lost men in the war didn't seem important to King George, nor did the fact that Americans had always managed their own money up until now. I mean, they were English subjects, weren't they? Didn't English subjects have to obey the English government? So in 1765, King George said, aha, I'll start this thing called the Stamp Act. And he made them pay a tax on certain printed items. King George was amazed that Americans objected, which means that they disagreed with it. He was flabbergasted that they claimed that he had no right to make them pay this money. Just because they had no say in the matter, just because they had no representatives in the English government. What was more, Americans refused to pay. If they agreed to one of these little taxes, they thought, then what would come next? A window tax? A tax on any fireplace? Now King George believed that above all, a king should be firm. But the government had the vote. And in the end, it voted to repeal tax. We're not paying this. We are not paying this. Still, King George was pleased about one thing. The government stood firm on England's right to tax the colonies. And in 1767, the government tried again. This time, the tax was on lead, tea, paint, and a number of items England sold to America. Part of the money from this tax was to be used to support an English army to keep order in America. Part was to pay governors and judges previously under the control of the colonies. Who could object to that? The king asked. So, guys, I just want you to remember real quick, and I wish I should have this picture right now. But remember, we had this huge ocean, right? And then the colonies were over on this part of the ocean. Yeah, this is a red ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is red. And then the king was way over here. And it took months to sail from one end to the other. These colonies broke away generations ago. And they're starting to realize, hey, we don't need, remember, these are colonies, we don't need this king. We should not be paying all this money to them. Sorry, we're over here now. Okay. So, who could object to that? The Americans did. They hated the whole business so much, especially the English soldiers stationed in their midst, that when the other taxes were replaced and only the tea tax remained, well, they wouldn't put up with it. So the tea arrived in Boston. So what they do? They dumped all that tea into the Boston Harbor. Oh my goodness, when he heard the news, King George felt more like a father than he ever had in his life. A father with a family of very, very disobedient children. And of course, he must punish them. So he closed the port of Boston and took away the right of Massachusetts to govern itself. And what else he did, which they talked about already? He sent all these soldiers over here to keep order. And then he also just said, hey, go live in their house. Firm, firm, firm. From now on, he would be firm. After the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Bunker Hill, King George said he felt strong as a lion. People would soon see that, he said, that the Americans are going to back down, meek as lambs. But instead, on July 4th, 1776, Americans declared their independence. Naturally, King George was annoyed, but he wasn't worried. How could children, however rebellious, succeed against a firm father, he thought? How could a few colonies hold out against a powerful empire? He just sent a few more regiments over and then watched the Americans come around. It never occurred to George the Third that he might not be right. I wish nothing but good, he once said. Therefore, everyone who does not agree with me is a traitor, scoundrel. For a while, King George had every reason to feel confident. The English troops captured New York, and when George heard this, he said, one more battle and this whole war will be over. When he was told that his troops had marched into Philadelphia, he ran into the Queen's room. I beat them, he shouted. I beat all the Americans. But he didn't beat them. The fighting went on, and meanwhile, George III had to go about the business of being a king. He put his seal on official papers, gave out medals and titles. He memorized the name of every ship in the Navy, tasted the food sent to the troops. He checked on who was spending what, and for hours on end, he listened to people talk. Indeed, being a king, especially a good king, was, well, it was often boring. He couldn't even drop a glove without half of the palace, it seems, stooping to pick it up and arguing about who should have the honor of returning it. Oh, never mind the honor, the king once said. Never mind, never mind. Just give me my glove. What? 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 Yes, you all picked it up. Yes, 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 yes. All. You all picked it up. King George had a habit of talking rapidly and repeating himself so that his talk often sounded like, well, like a gobble. But as king, he did have few advantages. He was, for instance, the most prayed for man in the empire. Naturally, it was pleasant to think of the heavy traffic of prayers ascending on his behalf every Sunday morning. from every country church, in every city cathedral, in every corner of the kingdom, but not in America. There, the preachers gave up praying for him when the punishment started. The king was also the most toasted man. No party except for in America began without all the people present raising their glasses and wishing the king a long life. The king wished it too, and he had the biggest birthday celebration. Every year on June 4th, all of his subjects, well, except for in America, of course, they celebrated his birthday with parades and banquets and speeches and gunfire and fireworks. All those prayers and toasts and fireworks were not to be sneezed at. Still, there were times when George wanted to forget about being a king. Fortunately, he did have hobbies to turn to. For one thing, he made metal buttons. He loved turning a lathe. He wrote articles on farming and signed himself Ralph Richardson, which was the name of one of his shepherds. He played backgammon with the officers of the royal household, and he collected ship models, coins, clocks, and watches. He had a four-sided clock that even showed the tides. He played the flute, harpsichord, hunted and studied the stars in his private observatory. And for the Queen's special amusement, well, he maintained a zoo, which consisted of one elephant and one zebra. But always in the end, he had to go back to being a king, back to the problem of America. This is what he had thought of America, a problem. King George did not really think of the Revolutionary War as a war until the fall of 1777, when 5,000 of his soldiers, they surrendered to the Americans in Saratoga. How could such a thing happen? The king asked. Hadn't he been told, even by an ex-governor of Massachusetts, that Americans would give up? That only a small number of Americans were actually against the king? And how could he, a peace-loving king, find himself in an honest-to-goodness war with his own colonies? He tried to console himself. He was a good king, he said, and good kings deserve to win. So this must just be a temporary setback. All he had to do was show the world that he wasn't the least bit worried. So that night, after hearing about the defeat, King George went to a court party and spent the evening telling stupid jokes and laughing so uproariously that his prime minister, Lord North, had to take him aside, try to quiet him down. The war dragged on. France, which, well, they were impressed with the victory at Saratoga, they ended up joining the war on America's side. There were people in England now who wanted to stop this fighting, but not George. No, 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 never, never, no independence, no peace without honor. If one group of English colonists got away, what would happen to the others? What would be left of his empire? But no matter how he showed himself in public, privately, George was super depressed. The world was not staying settled, everything in a place, the way he liked it. Not only was America acting up, but there were actually difficulties in his own land of England as well. Riots, even. And George's own family was misbehaving. Two of his brothers were involved in scandals. And George's son, the Prince of Wales, was so contrary that he deliberately arrived for meals as much as an hour late, although he knew that the king wanted everyone to be there exactly on time. On November 25th of 1781, the news reached London that the English army under General Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown to General Washington. I've never heard of the guy. When Lord North heard this, he threw up his arms. "It's all over," he said. But the king said nothing was over. They still had ships, hadn't they? He named them. They still had officers. He learned their names too. He still had troops. They still had guns and gunpowder. King George set his lips firmly and wrote a letter to the Secretary of State for America. This defeat, he said, should not make the smallest difference in their plans. Still, King George was so upset that when he dated the letter, he forgot to record the hour and the minute of the writing. And 2 days later, the king addressed the government. I prohibit you from thinking of peace, he thundered. But the government did think of peace. And eventually, the government voted for peace. So now what? King George couldn't fight the war all by himself. He couldn't chop off the heads of all those who had voted for peace. Jeez. King didn't do that. Kings didn't do that anymore. He could, of course, abdicate, quit the king business altogether. For a time, he thought seriously of this. He even drafted an announcement of his abdication. Abdication. I think that's how you say that. But then he put it away in his desk. He was so used to being a king. So when the time came for him to sign the peace proclamation, well, he signed it. And as soon as he had finished, he jumped on his horse and he took a hard gallop away from the palace. When the time came to announce in public the separation of the two countries and the independence of America, he swallowed hard and announced. Afterward, he asked a friend if he had spoke loudly enough. As long as he lived, King George had nightmares about the loss of the American colonies. It certainly hadn't been his fault, he said, but he hadn't done much of anything wrong. He had just watched to teach the Americas a lesson. It's a great story. It's a great part of history. I mean, it's a part of America's history. All right, what we were supposed to really focus on here is fact versus opinion. So after reading the story, you're know a few more facts about the American Revolution. Now, facts are statements that can actually be proven to be true. So like the statement, British lost the America colonies during the reign of King George III, that's a fact. It can be looked up, it can be referenced, and it could be proven true. Okay, and then we also heard some opinions. Opinions are statements that express thoughts, feelings, or beliefs. They often included statements like George III was the worst ruler in British history. It can never be proven true or false. Even if you say something that most people agree with, it's still not a fact. The other thing that we looked at is tones. Tone is the writer's attitude towards his or her subject. So this story actually had kind of a humorous tone. And then similes we've talked about all year. That's comparing two things using the word like or as. All right, you guys will have a quick comprehension question to fill out just to show that you read the story with me. And this is our story for the week. So you will have a test on Thursday of this story. All right, we're done.